Elias Boone had spent 14 years on the same stretch of hard Wyoming earth, waking before dawn to the sigh of wind pushing against the sagging barn boards and the quiet ache inside his ribs that felt older than his bones. He had come west young and full of noise, but the years had weathered him into a man who spoke mostly to horses and dust. The nearest town was 2 days' ride, and he only went when salt ran low or boots split open, and even then he kept his hat down and his words few. Folks called him the quiet farmer who preferred cattle to company, and Elias never argued, because loneliness, once it settled in, became as familiar as the creak in his left knee and the way silence filled a room like smoke. On the last trip he ever made without knowing his life was about to change, he rode into Bitter Creek for feed and found the whole town wound tight around the trading post, voices sharp, men's faces turned towards something he couldn't see. He tied his horse and pushed through, expecting trouble of the usual kind, but instead found a woman sitting on the ground with her hands bound loosely in front of her, her back straight, her dark eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the dusty street. Someone said she was Apache, left behind after soldiers forced her band south months before, and the traders didn't know what to do with her except try to hand her off to whoever would take responsibility. They spoke about her like she was an unwanted animal, something dangerous, something inconvenient. Elias felt heat crawl up his throat, not from anger exactly, but from the knowledge that no living soul deserved to be stared at like that. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, only knew the way she held herself reminded him of a lone pine that didn't bow to storms. When the man running the post muttered that she'd be shipped east if no one stepped in, Elias heard his own voice before he decided to speak, rough and unused, saying he'd take her. The trader shrugged and waved him off to sign a release, more paperwork than price, and Elias understood he wasn't buying her, he was paying to end a situation that never should have existed in the first place. Still, shame hung on him like dust. When he cut the bindings from her wrists, she didn't flinch or look at him. She simply stood, tall and silent, and followed only because there was nowhere else to go. Her name, he learned on the second night of travel when she finally spoke, was Nolin, and though he didn't know the meaning, he bowed his head when she said it, the first gesture of respect he could offer. They rode mostly in silence, stopping at dusk to share firelight and dry bread, and even though she kept distance between them, Elias never tried to close it. He slept lightly with his rifle near, but not because he feared her, he only feared doing something wrong without knowing why. On the third day, a storm rolled in fast, dragging cold rain across the plains in sheets. When lightning split the sky and his horse spooked, Nolin caught the reins with a steadiness that surprised him, guiding the animal back before it could kick itself lame. They reached the homestead soaked through, the roof leaking in 2 places Elias had meant to fix since spring, and he gestured toward the dry room where she could sleep while he took the barn. But she shook her head and pointed toward the corner near the stove instead, choosing her own space, and Elias nodded, learning his second lesson. Offering wasn't the same as deciding for her. That night the wind screamed like something alive, rattling shutters and sending hay scattering, and Elias stayed awake listening to the storm and the soft sound of Nolin breathing. He realized then that for the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It didn't feel like his grief had room to stretch its arms. It felt guarded, watched over by someone who didn't trust him and owed him nothing, yet still shared the same roof without fear. As dawn bled slowly across the plains, Elias stepped outside to check on the animals and found tracks around the chicken coop, not human, but wolf, drawn by the storm and the smell of livestock. Before he could lift his rifle, Nolin appeared beside him with a bow he didn't own, one she must have carved in the night from a cedar beam stored behind the barn. She didn't speak, just nodded to show she understood the land better than he did, and in that moment Elias knew the first scene of his life had ended, the one where he believed silence meant he was alone. Something new had entered, quiet as dawn, and though he didn't yet understand it, he felt the ground beneath him shift. Months passed, not quickly but steadily, like water shaping stone. Nolin moved through the homestead without asking permission, not out of defiance but because she refused to become a shadow in someone else's house. She repaired the fence where the posts leaned, taught Elias how to read the sky before weather arrived, and showed him plants growing at the creek that could soothe fever or stitch a wound closed faster than any store-bought tonic. She never spoke of the past unless he asked gently, and even then her words came like stones placed carefully, each one carrying weight. Elias learned to listen instead of fill silence, learned that trust wasn't something given but returned. In late summer, when the grass turned gold and the nights grew cool again, he woke to find her saddle missing. She had taken the mare and ridden out before sunrise, not running away but reclaiming something, freedom, choice, the right to leave. Elias sat on the steps of the porch with his coffee growing cold, his chest aching with a kind of loss he had no right to feel, and waited because that was all he could do. He would never send anyone after her. 3 days later she returned, dust on her boots, her hair braided with red clay, and when Elias opened his mouth to ask why, she spoke first. She said she had found no trace of her people near the old trails, only burned ground and silence. Her voice didn't break, but the wind seemed to stop and listen. Elias didn't offer comfort. He simply said she would always have the choice to stay or go, and for the first time she looked directly into his eyes long enough that he had to look away. Autumn settled in with slow grace, mornings crisp enough to frost the pump handle and evenings soft with the smell of wood smoke. They worked side by side without the constant tension that once filled the air, and sometimes Nolin sang under her breath while carrying water from the well, a song with no words Elias understood but one that made the hair on his arms rise as if the land itself remembered. One night she asked him why he had lived so long without anyone near, and he told her the truth. His wife had died from fever in their first winter, and he had stayed because leaving felt like abandoning a promise he never spoke. Nolin listened without pity, only quiet recognition, and when he finished, she placed a hand on the table between them, not touching his but close enough that warmth crossed the distance.